She walked down the aisle as if she were carrying the weight of an entire household on her spine. Silk whispered against marble. A hush folded like linen over the congregation. Adeline Monroe's breath came in small, rehearsed counts. 1, 2, because panic was an indulgence she could not afford in front of 100 watchful faces, and the whisper-thin hope she had bought for her parents. Her father sat rigid in the front row, his hand on her mother's knee, eyes fixed as if by looking away he might lose whatever remained of the plan that had kept them afloat. The chandeliers in the cathedral caught the gold thread of her veil and threw it back into the room like a promise. She had not come here to find love. She had come to keep a house from being stripped bare of its dignity, to cover medical bills, to keep her father's doctor on call. She had come with the ledger of her family's needs printed into the back of her throat. She had come because the alternative, humiliation, foreclosure, the slow erasure of a life, was something her mother could not bear, and her father's heart most certainly could not withstand. Lucian Vale stood at the altar like a statue that had learned to breathe. He was not handsome in the trivial ways the tabloids loved. His features were the kind that carried their own weather, as if shadows and light had argued over him and been allowed to stay. When Adeline first met him, standing in a glassed room on the 31st floor of his Manhattan penthouse, she had been struck by the way the air seemed to tilt around him. People leaned toward him, and histories shifted. He had been introduced in a manner designed to sound legal and discreet, a benefactor, a collector of promises, a man whose wealth was inked in contracts and whose favors were balanced on terms with a clarity she had never seen in her life. He had offered a contract that would restore her family's fortunes and cover her father's care in exchange for a marriage, an agreement sealed in signatures and a private clause she had refused to read. There were rules around him, unspoken but iron-hard. He was, his lawyer had said in an antiseptic voice, a man of peculiar obligations. He kept ledgers for things most people considered metaphors, debts of loyalty, vows passed down like heirlooms, promises that sat in rooms and grew cold if not tended. For centuries, rumor had called such a figure many things. For Adeline, the word that mattered was simple and practical. Solution. She had consented. She had drawn up a list of contingencies, of staircases to climb if one step failed, of ways to wedge the family's survival into the corner of someone else's power. She had rehearsed her smile the way one rehearses a difficult speech. Everything about the plan was transactional and tidy, until the night in the rehearsal hall when Lucian's fingers brushed the back of her hand as he handed her the vows, and something inside her unclipped. That touch was small and precise, not the heat of a lover but the precision of someone finding a map. He did not speak of promises that evening. He told her instead the name of the flower at the end of her bouquet and how it reminded him of a winter he'd once watched unravel like a scarf. The guests laughed politely at the anecdote. Adeline felt in her bones the first crack of something that looked dangerously like hope. If you love high-stakes supernatural romances, stay with this story. There is more coming. But the hush that followed the small talk in the rehearsal was not merely social courtesy. It was the sound of a life being reconsidered. Adeline realized then that this marriage, which she had once thought of strictly as a ledger entry, was not simply a contract between parties. It was a threshold that would demand of her more than signatures and a steady face. The weeks before the wedding unraveled like a tapestry being taken down thread by careful thread. Her father's cough grew stealthier and more cruel. Her mother stayed up late keeping accounts and smiling at column figures that no longer balanced. Adeline took late trains and counted the beats of her heart as if it were an errant metronome. Her friends, the ones she had kept at arm's length to save them the burden of scandal, came to whisper around her like sparrows. She told them the same thing she told herself every night. This is a sacrifice for love of family, not a surrender of self. Lucian's world bled into hers in small increments. He brought a quiet that felt like a presence, not an absence, the way his gloves always left a faint scent of ink and lemon, the way he preferred his windows open to hear the city breathe. He had rules, but he also had rituals of care. He left a steaming cup of tea on her nightstand with a small slip of card, for sleep. He adjusted the temperature in rooms she passed through as if he could sense the precise angle at which a draft touched her skin. These gestures were not the grandeur of roses and sonnets. They were the quieter, stranger things that nestle into a life and claim it as their own. On the morning of the wedding, Adeline's hands trembled not from cold, but from the awareness of how many lives hinged on this single act. She moved with deliberation. Each step toward the altar was a ledger entry made manifest. The priest's voice rose and fell, but to Adeline it had become background noise. Her father's eyes were wet but defiant. He would not give her the look of pity she most feared. The guests watched with the particular pleasant cruelty of those who assume everything is a story for their entertainment. Lucian's vows were precise. His words were measured as if he had tested them against a rulebook. Then, at the moment his voice softened, he said something no contract could require. "I will keep you," he said, and the phrase trembled at the edges. He did not promise eternity in the way poets meant the word. He promised continuity, an acceptance of presence that was not bound to ledger lines. It was not the sort of crisis that comes with a shout. It arrived as a small unreeling, like a thread pulled back into daylight. After the ceremony, in the quiet of the Vale estate where Lucian lived, an old house dressed in modern glass and watchful rooms, Adeline found herself alone with him in a library that smelled of lemon oil and old paper. He put his hand at the small of her back with that same delicate care. "Tell me," he said, "do you think you have done the right thing?" She thought he meant the family's security. He meant something else. His question was not about bank accounts or the hush of creditors. It was about the ethical wound that had opened between them. She told him honestly. She had no illusions about romantic rescue. She had done what a daughter should do. In his gaze, something unwound. It was a look that did not respect the terms of the contract. It respected a person. They did not fall into the melodrama of whispered confessions in that library. There was no overnight revelation that rewired their lives in a single breath. Instead, love, if it could be called that so early, arrived in fragments. A hand pressed to the small of her back when she had a bad dream, a quiet presence by her bedside while their housekeeper fussed over places at the table, the way Lucian remembered in offhand comments the name of the childhood doll her sister had lost when they were young. These were not the grand declarations that save novels. They were increments of attention that could, if stitched together, make a garment strong enough to hold two people. Yet with that attention came a shape of danger. Lucian was a man whose life was regulated by rules older than the city's skyline. He had found his way into the world, carrying obligations that were as precise as timepieces. He tended to contracts the way a gardener tended roses, carefully, methodically, knowing when to prune and when to let things grow. To love, for him, was a variable that had the power to unbalance his equations. He told her in a voice like a ledger closing, "There are things I do to preserve what I am. To truly give myself to someone is to risk everything that keeps me as I have been." Adeline had expected the moral dilemma. She had not expected the way the knowledge would sit in her ribs like a stone. For all her sacrifices, she discovered a fresh choice pressed against her palm. She could stand fast to the plan she had made, hold the marriage as a formality, a life shield for her family, and retreat into a carefully managed life. Or she could answer to something softer and stranger that made her want to stay when the bargaining was done. Days at the Vale estate unfolded with a rhythm that made honesty unavoidable. Nights were thick, with a silence that licensed truth-telling. Lucian's tenderness rotated like a slow, deliberate moon. He was careful in the way he kissed the small places of her hands, and careful in a manner that suggested practice, not clumsiness. He knew the anatomy of restraint. He also knew how to welcome confessions. He surprised her with small, unarranged gifts. A first edition of a book she had loved in college, a pressed leaf from a tree whose shade she had once longed for as a child. He admitted to nights of reading her letters when she was asleep, of rewriting clauses in the contract, because they made him uncomfortable at odd hours, because he had found himself reading the human lines of life with a new attention. It would have been simple and perhaps safer if he had remained the cool, distant man everyone expected him to be. But people are not sculptures. Lucian tilted toward her in ways that had the force of gravity. Slowly, he began to breach constraints that had defined him for years. He started to keep photographs, small, private evidences of life, on a shelf in the study. He began to postpone meetings to listen to stories from her childhood. He stopped treating the world like a room full of contracts and began instead to mark time by small kindnesses. That shift mattered because it revealed something that frightened him. Affection could not be filed away in the way he had once thought. It changed the arithmetic of his immortality. To love her, he realized, might be to undo the very thing that allowed him to remain unchanged. They learned one another through the pulled threads of intimacy and momentary scandal. Adeline learned that immortality had gifted Lucian with a peculiar loneliness, the kind that comes from watching everything change except yourself. He told her once of watching a theater troupe perform the same play for decades and of memorizing every actor's face as if time kept returning with different collars. He said it without melodrama. It was simply a fact, everlasting observation, with no one to look back and anchor him, had hollowed him in places he had not suspected. She, for her part, began to understand the cost that his existence demanded. Loving an immortal is not, she realized, a romantic problem to solve. It is a moral geometry where the vertices are lives. Her choice to marry to save her family had already set pieces in motion she could not stop, but she had not expected to be the one who pressed the final, irreversible button. The first real crisis arrived in the quiet of the moonlit garden at the Vale estate. Lucian stood beneath a yew tree, the leaves glinting like black coins in the lamplight. The air was wet from a rain that had decided at some point in the night to come and leave the ground scented and slow. He had called to her, a rare summons, in that careful tone that suggested both apology and confession. She found him with his hands clutched at his coat, as if holding himself together with spoken garments. "I have done what I promised," he began, and the sentence held no boast. "Your family's debts are covered. The house will stand. I have seen to that." She nodded. She had expected gratitude and final accounting. What followed was nothing like the expected ledger. "But there is a cost," he said. "For me there is always a cost. I have lived by certain rules. They kept me consistent. They kept me a certain kind of person. To love you as you deserve, to be present to you in the way a mortal is present, would require me to loosen those constraints." He did not speak of dramatic transformations in sweeping, melodramatic terms. He spoke of small things that added up into the unimaginable, forgetting names, succumbing to the vulnerable edges of grief, the slow erosion of the unending vantage point that had defined his experience. "If I choose what you ask of me," he said, "I may no longer be what I am now." Adeline's first reaction was practical. Did this undo the legal terms of the contract? Could the family be sure that the fortune remained safe if the nature of the man who promised it shifted? Lucian answered that question with the kind of meticulous detail she was used to relying on. Yes, the legal protection stood, but the personal consequences would be different. He would step away from the posture of a collector of promises. And then he said something she had not anticipated. He placed his hand over his heart and in small, even tones asked her a question that demanded agency. If it must be either this, my continued existence as I am, or something else that makes me mortal, who are you asking me to be? Who are you asking yourself to be? It was not an ultimatum, it was a pivot. The choice that had once felt straightforward, marry to save them, split into branches. She could keep the safety they had arranged and live with a kind of elegant, contained distance. Or she could allow herself to be fully present with a man who would become liable to weaknesses and loneliness and all the messy things mortality brings. She would lose the life she had planned, the clean guarantees, the armor of privilege that had shielded her family's shame, and become entangled in a life that was unpredictable and exposed. That night, Adeline did not answer at once. She walked through the garden, the vowels of her life rearranging beneath the sky. There were things that comforted her in certainty, the feeling of being the person who knew which bills were due, who made decisions for others. To care for her family had always been a cloak she could wrap tightly around herself. To relinquish that certainty would be to stand naked before an unknown. She thought of her father, who had taught her how to balance a column of numbers before he learned the words for heartbreak. She thought of her mother, who had smoothed dresses for other people's mothers and had never had someone smooth hers. She thought of the neighbor girls who had once laughed at the soft way she tucked her hair behind her ear and how their laughter would turn to something else when they saw what she had become. She thought of the future she had envisioned, steady, safe, a life of precise arrangements. Anything else would be a gamble. Lucian waited as if knowing that her mind needed the slow solvent of thought. "This decision is not mine to make alone," he said softly. "You did not marry me to become less of yourself, but you did come here to save others. That truth is still here. Tell me what you need." She found, in the silence between them, a kind of honesty she had not expected to own. "I need to know I chose with eyes open," she said. "I need to know this was not only about ledger lines, but about the person I am when no one is watching. If loving you costs me the life I understood, I need to know I'm not stepping into bondage. I need to know I'm still myself." He listened as if memorizing a shape. "Then choose," he said, "not for your family's safety alone, but for what you might become if you step forward. Not to save me. I am not a thing to rescue. Choose because you want this, knowing it will change both of us." She chose. It was not a dramatic, sweeping sacrifice in terms of physical proof. She did not sign away her name on a sheet of paper in a fever. Instead, she spoke with clarity in the moonlight. "I cannot promise you that I will never be afraid," she said. "I cannot promise I won't sometimes wish I had never had to choose, but I will not step back into the life I had if it means giving up the truth of what could be. I will stand with you. I will take on the consequences. I will be as present as a human heart can be." Those words were not payment. They were consent shaped into a willingness that had to be paid for in the currency of life. The shock of it did not come in the moment. It came later, when the consequences took on faces. Lucian honored his word. He loosened the small protections he had always kept. He relinquished the habits by which he had kept his days unbroken. There were mundane signs of the change. He began to forget names occasionally, to misplace the odd thing, to feel sudden sorrow watching a dog cross a street. He tasted rain like someone tasting the texture of a coin, and then found himself changed by the experience. He began to feel hunger as fatigue instead of a sterile desire. He laughed at jokes he had previously catalogued and filed away. Some nights he wept, no longer distant, but in the quiet way that implied a wound and a tending hand. For Adeline, the price she paid was not a single catastrophic loss. It revealed itself as a pattern of unraveling certainties. The family's financial security was intact. The creditors had been paid, the hospital bills handled, the mortgage squared. Yet the thing she had bargained for, predictability and control, had slipped out of her fingers. Her life, once a composed ledger, became a living book with margins she could no longer straighten. Society, always hungry for stories, found new narratives and fed them to itself. Some admired the bravery of the arrangement. Others whispered darker things about strange men and foolish girls. The tabloids worked themselves into a flurry of speculations. Lucian Vale was an enigma in a suit, the woman who had married him either a genius or a madwoman. The handshakes and invitations shifted in tone. There was a tilt in heritage conversations that exposed Adeline's family in ways that made her mother's cheeks flush with something like shame. The very privacy she had sought to protect was traded into the public ledger of gossip. She paid, too, in the loss of the future she had imagined. Once she had been a woman who could plan, to whom the future had been a map she could trace with a finger. Now the map had modified lines, and suddenly there were blank spaces. She faced nights of fear, an anxiety that had the form of a slow, distant thunder, about what she had done. Had she bettered them, or merely swapped one peril for another? Had she misread the ledger and given herself for a promise that would not hold under pressure? And there was a deeper price, less visible but more corrosive, the exposure of her inner life. As Lucien learned to be present, he also learned to observe without mediation. He saw her when she was small and private, when she wept in the kitchen because a bill had tipped the balance, when she laughed too long at a silly joke to hide the strain, when she stood at the window in the dead of night and measured her doubts against the city skyline. He held these private parts of her as a man holds delicate glass. It was not cruel. It was not possessive. It was intimate. But intimacy requires a surrender, an exposure of self that is a form of loss. To lose privacy is to become more known, and, in turn, more vulnerable. The greatest facet of the price, however, was not external. It was the quiet recalibration of how she saw herself. For all the heroic articulation she had rehearsed, for all the nights she had whispered herself stern admonitions, she discovered something shaky at the center of her will, a yearning for a life she had not planned but wanted nonetheless. She had thought herself practical and chosen pragmatism. Once she began to love Lucien, not only as a man who could repair their bank statements, but as someone whose presence altered the air. She found that her love required an honesty about her own desires that she had not anticipated. There were nights when she would lie awake and imagine the life she might have had, the steady job in the real estate office, the small garden she would tend, the afternoons with her mother sitting in the sun. Those lives did not vanish. They were simply reframed by what she had chosen. Grief has many shapes. Some of her grief was for the death of that planned life. Some of it was an acknowledgement of the bravery it took to live without the assurances she had been given. To step into an unknown is heroic in its own way. But heroism demands a price. People like to create dramatis personae for sacrifice. They want to weigh it on a scale and announce a victor. Adeline's sacrifice did not lend itself to such neat adjudication. In choosing to stay, she did not purchase happiness. She paid with a life rearranged, with the exposure of her family to the public eye, with a relinquishing of control. She also gained something, an honest presence in another person's life, a love that insisted on the equal vulnerability of two people. She had expected to be the provider of safety. Instead, she became a participant in a shared fragility. Then came the final turning, quiet and precise. Lucien had spoken of the cost. Then he lived it. One evening, with the city lights dimmer than usual, he took her hand in a way that contained the weight of centuries and then the lightness of a human laugh. "I have made the change," he said simply. "I am no longer as I was." She felt the ground tilt in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had chosen to step into mortality, to be subject to time in the way that terrifies and consoles humans alike. The mythic thing she had married was now, by his own choice, reducible to a human rhythm: sleep, hunger, pain, age. The thing that had once made him formidable, the inscrutable steadiness, had been pulled apart, thread by costly thread. The public had its reaction. Some called it a miracle, others called it a downfall. For Adeline, the more immediate shock was personal. His hands, which had once been remote, grew wilder with emotion. He could laugh and cry in the same minute. He could be hurt, he could suffer, he could love with an immediacy that was at once wonderful and dangerous. She had always vowed to protect her family, but now she must protect a man who was no longer unassailable. She must adopt new responsibilities, care that blurred the lines between duty and desire. In the days after his transformation, the cost was tangible. The family's position in society shifted. Some offered congratulations, others sneers. There were invitations that dried up as easily as the rain. Old acquaintances became careful in their speech. Her mother, who had once guarded her composure with armor, grew thin and distracted. There were nights when her father would stare at the fire as if measuring the worth of what had been traded. "You paid too much," he would murmur sometimes, not unkindly. He meant the exposure, the vulnerability, the loss of a life she might have had. He meant the risk. Adeline heard him and would only say, "We are alive." But deeper than that social erosion, the shock landed in her as a learned ignorance. She had thought she would be a giver of security. She had not expected to become the vulnerable one. It was a role reversal that required new skills and a humility she had not rehearsed for. She found herself learning to care for a man who could feel pain, who could grow old, who could be frightened in ways she could not predict. She became, in a quiet domesticity, the companion she had never imagined being. She cooked for him with a care that felt like devotion and argued with him at the breakfast table about things that had once felt trivial. She watched him as he learned to live inside a body that grew tired and felt the daily delicacy of that life. The most intimate part of her price was the relinquishment of certainty about the future. She had spent so many years building the scaffolding of predictable decisions that being without them felt like shipwreck. She had thought the bargain would be clear, neat, and predictable. Instead, she learned about compromise. She learned that love is not an end state, but an ongoing negotiation with the self. She would be tested in ways numbers never could predict. She would be called upon to make choices at midnight, to sit with fears she had not known existed, to hold a hand as someone endured a fever. It was a heavy and messy kind of responsibility. Yet there was another side to that sacrifice, one that no one could have measured on a ledger. The exposure she paid for brought with it an unmooring that allowed for a kind of rebirth. Without the brittle certainty of plans, she found that small, everyday things tasted sharper. The sound of Lucien's laugh, the way sunlight slanted through the study at 3 in the afternoon, the way her mother finally began to sleep through the night as if some weight had been lifted. She had given up a future of safe certainties and, in return, gained a life in which every morning was uncharted and therefore could be inhabited fully. The morning they walked back into the Vale estate after Lucien's change, the dawn was a slow painter, turning the world from iron to honey. They passed through the house where servants knew the soft cadence of their days and into a garden that had held so many of their conversations. Lucien's hand was warm in hers. He moved with a kind of domestic grace he had never needed before. There was fragility in his step, a small stoop in his shoulders that marked the weight of human tasks. Adeline walked beside him with a steady resolve. She had paid a price, and she was living inside its consequences. She had saved her family in the way she intended, but the victory had not come without an exchange. "I thought I'd lost everything that mattered," she said once, stopping beneath an espalier of apple trees. They had both been laughing about something small and ridiculous, a neighbor's attempt at gardening that had ended in flour and apologies, and the sound of it made her feel like a stranger, seeing a city she loved from an unfamiliar street. I thought this would mean the end of who I am. Lucian looked at her with eyes that no longer seemed set outside time. You paid, he said simply. You paid by giving up the life you had planned. You paid by being known. You paid by choosing uncertainty. But you did not sacrifice yourself. You chose to be present with me. You chose not to keep others safe at the cost of your own truth. Her price had been a mosaic of losses, the disappearance of an imagined future, the exposure of private family wounds to a public that loved spectacle, the erosion of a carefully stewarded control. It was also a price that taught her how to wield vulnerability like a blade, sharp, true, instrumental. She had moved from a life of ledger duties to one where love required daily acts of courage. That was not something she had expected when she first walked into Lucian Vale's glassed world with contracts in hand. But it was a truth she could live with. If there was a miraculous redemption in this bargain, it lay not in the preservation of what had been, but in the integrity of what had been chosen. The city watched them in a new light. Friends and enemies found their attitudes rearranged. Some of the invitations returned to the family's door, shaded now with a different tone, an acceptance of the unconventional that had something like admiration in it. Her mother's hands, once prone to tremble whenever bills arrived, grew steadier. Her father walked with a bright, if fragile, steadiness. The house stayed. The doctors remained. And the practical problems that had set her on this path were resolved. But the heart of the title, that shocking price, remained hers to carry. No one could give her back the certainty she had traded. No one could erase the nights when fear would bite at her stomach, and she would hold the fragile, mortal man beside her and wonder if storms would break them. There were no triumphant declarations that declared the ledger balanced. Instead, there was a new economy of care, one that required them both to spend of themselves in ways they had not anticipated. In the quiet that followed, Adeline learned how to be both brave and ordinary. She learned how to make appointments, how to argue about grocery lists, how to ease a fever, and how to listen without trying to fix the unfixable. She realized that being the person who saves a family did not mean she had to become a martyr. She could save them, and also save herself. That, perhaps, was the most surprising outcome of all. Her sacrifice was not a subtraction, but a conversion. She had paid with certainty and control, and she had received a life that demanded presence and honesty. On a Sunday morning some months later, when the linens smelled like lemon and continuity felt like a fragile, hopeful thing, Adeline walked with Lucian through the small parlor where her mother had liked to read. They sat together on the sofa, their knees touching in a way that was a quiet testament to the new balance they had struck. Outside, someone played a piano with a patient hand. The house hummed with rhythms they had learned to keep together. "If people ask," he said, in a voice that had the lilt of newly human fatigue, "what did you lose?" She considered the question, feeling the weight of that phrase, "Did you lose or did you exchange?" in her mouth. "I lost the life I thought I wanted," she said finally. "I lost the certainty I'd traced all my life. I lost a kind of safety, yes. But I gained the truth that I was capable of choosing without guarantee. That seems a strange thing to call a cost. But it is." Lucian laughed softly, in that way that had once been rare and had become delightfully frequent. "Then, what was the price?" he asked. She turned to him. The morning braced them both in its soft light. "The shocking part," she said, "is not that I paid. The shocking part is that I would pay it again, knowing what I know now." He reached across and took her hand. It was an ordinary action, nothing like the contract that had started their lives together. It was the signature neither of them had thought to write down. It was a life rendered by touch. Some stories demand a tidy reckoning at their end. This one did not. There would be later moments, arguments, illnesses, the small betrayals that stitch themselves into long companionship, and they would have to negotiate them together with the fragile languages of apology and promise. The family's fortunes remained, the house stood. The world still valued headlines and spectacle. But in the small rooms of their lives, away from the gossip pages and the polite acquaintances, Adeline had learned the true nature of her cost. She had paid with a loss of certainty, with the exposure of her family's wounds, with a relinquishing of the life she had planned. In return, she had gained an honest, perilous love that required her to be brave every single morning. If you felt this story move you, if the ache of sacrifice and the strange blessing of vulnerability spoke to you, share this with someone who likes stories of love that require courage. And if you want more tales like this, follow for more. There are other lives, other bargains, and other prices yet to be told.